I'm delighted to be joined by this distinguished panel to talk about this issue of resilience and hopefully to talk about it in a way that helps the rest of the state understand why it's so important to this region. I'm joined by Clifford Barnett, who's a Wilmington City Council member and also partner of Warner Temple AME Zion Church. Jennifer Biddle, who's a professor here, associate professor of public administration, and who studies all sorts of very interesting things, including adaptive governance, and we'll have to talk about what that means. And then Rob Zapple, who is a new Hanover County Commissioner, also a small business owner, a general contractor. I want to start with you, Rob. Help us understand, when we talk about a resilient community, what does that mean?
Well, obviously, thank you, and good morning. Good morning to everyone here. And I'd like to just take a moment and recognize Chancellor Sardarelli, who's here in the audience today, and thank you very much for the use of UNCW, this beautiful campus, and ncIMPACT. Thank you so much for your interest in all of this. A resilient community is a lot of different definitions. I personally think it has to do with the ability to be able to prevent, withstand, respond to, and ultimately recover from a major disruption. And that would be described as a natural disaster or a pandemic or a changing climate, anything that will disrupt a community and their ability to, again, withstand it and recover.
Jennifer, you want to jump in and give us your thoughts here, since this is something that you study a lot?
Sure. When I think of resilience, oftentimes we hear the definition that's produced by NOAA, a very reputable agency, but it's the bouncing back from natural disasters or other emergency situations. And I think I'm among a majority of folks that take issue with that, is that we shouldn't be trying to bounce back to where we were, because we need to be leaping forward and going forward and trying to be more proactive. I often tell my students in policy analysis, the thinking that got us into the problem will not be the thinking that gets us out of it. So we have to revolutionize the way we think about how we want to live and move from there.
So let me stay with you for a moment. What is it that makes this region particularly vulnerable and therefore so focused on resiliency?
That's a great question, and I think that clip did a nice job really showcasing our vulnerability to things like the inland flooding, as well as storm surge. We have coastal erosion, and those increased storms, both in frequency and intensity, combined with sea level rise, are all kind of coming to this point in our area. We saw with these extreme tides, like the flooding last Wednesday, where we drive down College Road and the storm drains were bubbling onto the street because it was high tide and we had a full moon. And it's just those kind of combination of factors that are now starting to, I think, be a strong wake-up call to our region, that we need to rethink, we need to start doing more to prepare. We can't just be in a mitigative mode anymore. And then these coastal hazards, they lead problems. They kind of intensify social inequities that we are already experiencing as well. And so we can look at it from a multiple of factors. It's not just private property we need to protect or public infrastructure. We also have to protect vulnerable communities that bear the kind of larger share of the burden from these storms.
So we've talked about the wake-up call and the need to be disruptive as we build back. Help us understand a little bit about the lessons learned from Hurricane Florence in particular, and how that is leading the thinking about what resiliency needs to look like.
I think some of the lessons, and there were a number of lessons that we learned from Hurricane Florence. One of the lessons, of course, is that we want the whole community, everybody, to think from a resilience lens, meaning that everybody looks at each individual and says, not what's wrong with you, kid, or what happened to you, but you got strength, you've got abilities. And so what I think Florence taught us was also one of the things it taught me, and I pastor a church on the north side, it taught us the the disadvantages for some people who had resources and they could get their homes fixed, they could get their roofs put on, stuff like that. Whereas in other communities, they were lacking. And so one of the things I think that we did really well was we decided, okay, we need a resilience task force. We need a group of people to come together and talk about resilience so that the whole community, everybody is looking through the same lens, you know. And that's one of the lessons I think we learned. Another one, just like quickly, is that that there were communities, and you mentioned it, that there were communities or places that didn't have, and it really showed that even more. And unfortunately, you can ride around in some places in Wilmington today and still see blue tarps.
I hear you bringing into this conversation, and correct me if I'm putting words in your mouth. I'm good at that. Just hearing what I wanted to hear in the first place. But this idea that it's not just about sustainability, but that resilience has to consider equity also. Is that fair
Absolutely.
to say?
Absolutely.
Because all people aren't equally affected by these.
Right. We're not all starting at the same
events,
spot.
right.
We're not starting in the same spot. We all have different issues and different challenges. We even deal with ACEs, you know, adverse childhood experiences. All that's a part of helping people and helping communities become resilient.
The other thing I hear you saying, which is interesting because it's not typically part of the conversation about resilience, is it isn't just about the physical development. The human element has to be part of the conversation. Jenny, Rob, jump in. What are you thinking about this?
I couldn't agree more with what Clifford's saying, and I think just to add a little context for any of those who are listening out there who don't recognize where we are in southeast North Carolina, we're surrounded by water here, both the Atlantic Ocean on the east side, the Cape Fear River on our west side, and the Northeast Cape Fear River on our north side there. So we deal with water in every aspect of our lives, our physical lives as well as our built lives around everything. So when we get a hurricane like Florence, for instance, a great example, that is only a Category 1, and you have this tendency to think, oh, gee, it's just in a Category 1. Well, that really focuses on the wind damage. And instead, it came and dumped as anywhere from 28 to 30 inches of rain in our area over a 2 to 3 day period. And the impacts were all human, as we found out. Things like food distribution, the power grid going out, so there was no ability to recharge your cell phones. So there was no communication as to how to get things to people that needed it. Fuel supplies. All of a sudden we found ourselves, because of the flooding on I-40 and other major highways coming into New Hanover County, we were cut off. We were an island. And we were not unprepared, but it was certainly a shock. And it made a huge difference. And we found that 30% of our poorest communities are without a car. So just simple things as transportation. So when we go and say as a county, we want to evacuate, it's not that simple. You've got a large part of our population, many of us can go and stay someplace and be comfortable, but a big hunk of us can't even get out. So that puts the pressure onto shelters and hardened structures to protect our people. And then again, circling back to something as basic as food and food distribution. How do we get food to those people? And the reality of what happened is a lot of nonprofits, a lot of individuals, a lot of people in this room actually jumped up and started hauling food and water to the people who needed it. It was a full-on emergency, but what a wake-up call. And it's now on us to build back better so that we don't see these kind of things happening.
Go ahead, please.
One of the neat things that came out as a result of Hurricane Florence was we established the New Hanover Disaster Relief Coalition, which actually now has prepared places so that when another disaster comes, and it will come, knock on wood, but it's going to come. When another one comes, we already have places.
The pastor, he got it straight from above.
He worked like that with me. But the thing is that we've learned, though, that already have places established where folks can get food, where folks can get transportation. We've already done that. We weren't really as prepared when Florence came. We were better prepared when Dorian came through.
So now
Can I add one more thing? too? Because
absolutely, go ahead.
Clifford brought up the trauma part, the social trauma part, which I think is really critical. Because, knowing people that had lost their homes in Florence, lost all their possessions in the flooding from Matthew, lost lives, or even the displacement. If they could get out in Florence, you couldn't get back for many days, and being separated from family and loved ones and not knowing if they were okay because of the communication failures. And that takes its toll. And so I think that also is a critical piece that we need to focus on. And I know there's a lot of actually excellent faculty doing really good research on that here to address some of those kind of more of those social trauma elements.
I hear a lot of agreement on this panel about the consequences, and yet it's when we talk about the response that the tensions arise. And so let me start with you, Rob. What are the decision-making points for this region where there are tensions?
Well, in our world, so much of this, I hate to say it, but it boils down to money and how we spend those resources. We've had, like all communities across the United States, a great infusion of cash from the federal to state level through the CARES Act and now the ARP, the American Rescue Plan. And it's how we spend that money and how we are intentional on how we build back. And there will be necessarily disproportionate amounts of money going into different neighborhoods. So it is not all across the board, going to be equal like that, because we've recognized where some of these soft spots, where the need is greatest, to be able to kind of bring up and to protect as we go forward. So that is the cause of a lot of conversations. Some people feeling, we're not getting our fair share. Other people saying you're not doing enough. But again, it all boils back to the amount of money. The great thing is we are getting support. One area that is, talked about a lot in our coastal community is our beach renourishment and nourishment plan, which for a lot of people who don't live here don't understand the incredible importance of keeping our beaches broad and thick and a dune line that's strong. They think of it as possibly, well, that's great for tourism, but what the Sam Hill does it mean to me and resilience? Well, for our case, where we have our entire border of New Hanover County is along the Atlantic coast, it means huge difference, because those beaches, keeping them renourished as we have over the past 50 years with the help of the state and the federal government and our room occupancy tax and citizens and tourists all kicking into that, that's the reason when we get storms that come off the ocean, it helps diffuse that energy and really knocks it down, so you don't see massive destruction on the scale that you would see in other communities, because we put those investments very intentionally into it. And one more thing, and then I'll stop. You asked.
I asked about tensions. Apparently there are quite a few of them. Keep going.
It's planning and zoning. There's something as mundane as that and as boring as that, yet we spend a whole lot of our days looking at it and being much more intentional about where we build, where we allow to be built, how we build, get vertical, get out of that floodplain there, and start talking seriously about those people who insist on wanting to try and build back in what we know is a hazardous situation. Find a way to retreat from that and again, build up and out of the floodplain. That one thing alone would save so much money. So making those kind of investments and using the monies that we have to be intentional, and I'll stop.
If I could just add on,
No, because I'm going to ask you a question.
Oh,
and then
there you go.
the good news is I ask the question, then you can just answer whatever
Okay, fair enough.
it is that you wanted to say anyway. You talked about resiliency being the ability to leap forward earlier. How do you build consensus about what that looks like?
That's a great question. So anymore, it seems, when we define coastal resiliency, we're talking about the impacts to property, public infrastructure, and natural ecosystems. That seems to be where at least the three camps come. And of course, that's where a lot of the tension rises, because when you bring up protecting private property, and public infrastructure, a lot of that protection comes from natural systems that we're losing at a rapid pace. Land use loss and degradation degradation of the ecosystems themselves, we lose those natural buffers. So that's one piece of it, I think, and that raises up the issues of how do we zone in a more holistic way, where we consider the impacts of that particular development on its surrounding properties. And so I think my answer to the question of how do you build consensus, I come from a collaborative governance perspective, so it's bringing everyone together. It's community engagement. It's providing forums like this to educate, but then bringing all of the big stakeholders together in a room to talk it out, to hash it out, to work through the points of disagreement and find a common ground.
Terrific. And did you have a chance to say what you wanted to say?
Did.
Anyway, Clifford, I'm going to give you a chance to answer the same question about where you see the tensions and what are the opportunities for bringing people together to create some kind of common vision and consensus agenda. And while you're answering the question, those of you who have questions for the audience, please go ahead and make your way to the microphone.
Okay. I think that the neat thing is that there's plenty of opportunities. And I believe that one of the great things that we're doing here in New Hanover County is we are building consensus. We are bringing people together. An example could be the New Hanover County Resiliency Task Force. We have over 700 people from different organizations and communities who we're teaching everyone how to look at life from a resilient perspective. For example, everyone in the county has been trained through CRIM, Community Resilience Model, which talks about how to look at people and recognize that trauma has affected them and how to look at them from a different lens. So I think that there's a lot of opportunities for us to be resilient and cause consensus. One of the things that we did here, they established what is called the North Carolina Disaster Recovery and Resilience Alliance, which was made up of mayors from all of the other areas throughout the area, and we all pulled together and said, okay, here's what we need to do to make sure that we continue to be resilient in the days ahead.
So recognizing that this has to be a regional approach,
Yes,
which
absolutely.
I think a lot of communities miss from time to time, given the interrelatedness of our physical attributes. If your neighbors to the left or the right aren't paying attention to these issues, whatever you're doing is going to be mitigated, right?
Yeah.
Impressive. Audience, questions for this great panel?
Good morning.
Good morning.
Yay. I am so glad that both Jennifer and Rob mentioned the issue of planning and zoning. I think this is a struggle that we all have living in this community. I live in Surf City. At what point do we start talking seriously about the need for planned migration for those properties that just cannot be saved, no matter what hardened structure, no matter what dune you put in front of it? I wish it were something that wasn't going to happen in my lifetime, but it absolutely will. It is coming fast. And I'd love for your all's perspective on how, when you talk about consensus building, it is, to my mind, the most difficult thing that we can face right now is how do you encourage that, incentivize it?
And you thought I asked the hard questions.
I'm sorry, I missed your name? Ann. Ann, great question. The answer to that is it's already happening. Those kind of discussions are happening certainly within county, city governments, up and down the entire coast. And I know in New Hanover County, which I can speak most specifically to, we have an unfortunate situation that's happening that is driving that conversation, which is the federal government making the clear move to want to back out of beach renourishment. Again, an issue that we're still waiting to see how, if there's some way we can recapture it. But they have prompted a very vigorous debate within our own planning and zoning and elected officials. What happens to us if we don't have the $37 to $38 million to renourish our beaches? Where does that go? Well, the truth is it falls back on the community and on the local community and on the state. And that's going to change the balance. And so to your point of How do we move off the coast there? It's going to put a lot of pressure on the insurance companies who continue to insure properties that are clearly in a dangerous zone. It's going to change that dynamic a lot. Again, I hate, but so much of my life, it boils down to the money. And when you finally get to that point where it makes no sense to the property owner, that's going to be the biggest driver, although we can certainly move that conversation along by, again, being intentional as to where we plan and zone and allow and the type of structures that they have. The second part of that is preserving natural spaces. Here in New Hanover County, we only have 199 square miles, dry square miles there. So being very careful about leaving open spaces, natural spaces that allow Mother Earth to continue to do what they need to do in absorbing, that factors into this conversation as well. Thank you.
Other questions? So, Jenny, we're on the campus of UNCW, and everything I hear suggests that this campus is an amazing resource for these kinds of conversations and the science and the evidence that moves them forward. Say a little bit about the campus's contributions to the region, particularly this conversation about resiliency.
Yeah, happy to. The trick will be being thorough but concise, because there's a lot of work that's happening here at the university. I'll start at the top. We have right now, actually the open comment period is ending for our climate resiliency plan, as well as the sustainability action plan. And what I like about the way those two plans, they work in tandem, but they focus on different issues. Climate resiliency is really focusing more on the physical and infrastructure, and then the sustainability action plans focus more on the social and behavioral. And I think that two-pronged approach is really, really the way to go, especially if they're working, like I said, in tandem, so we're constantly kind of thinking about the overlaps and what that means. And so then we have different departments across the campus working on, as I mentioned, the social trauma aspects. We have also, new programs like our coastal engineering, really focusing more on structural stuff. We have great community engagement coming out of this university. The Center of Innovation and Entrepreneurship, Social Impact Center, and others are really working to try to engage community to help with those conversations, to help build that kind of consensus, that vision for what we want this area to look like. So it's been really wonderful kind of looking at all the great work that's being done here. And I feel like if we can just continue that effort and get it a bit out into the world, kind of through the, political processes that exist here, that would be a wonderful thing.
Clifford, I'm going to end with you and give you a chance to tell us really quickly what gives you most hope on this topic.
What gives me most hope is people working together. What gives me most hope is, and you shared it, not only just bouncing back, but bouncing forward. And we have a community that's going to be bouncing forward, and I'm excited. I'm excited about where we are and all the great things that will come about as a result of the disasters that wake us up.
I'm excited too, and incredibly impressed by the level of participation you all have articulated and the willingness to wrestle through the tough decisions. There will be tensions, no question about it. We're asking people to think fundamentally differently than they have had to think before. But I think the rest of the state will look to you as an example for how to do that work. Thank you all very much. Please join me in thanking this panel.